Hello and welcome to Talkernate History, the podcast where we,
Matt
and Max, talk about works of alternate history scenarios, and history in general. This episode, we're going to be talking about generals, alternate generals 2.
Oh, excited, Max. Been waiting for this one.
Yes. Just like the first one, this is a short story compilation, edited by our guy, Harry Turtledove.
Good job, Harry.
Good job, Harry. You're doing a bang-up job so far, I gotta tell you. This is, I think, 13, 14 different stories.
Somewhere around there, yeah.
Different authors, totally different time periods. The only thing holding them together is that there's a general in there somewhere, and that general...
Some more obvious than others.
Yes, yes, very true. But, you got the classics. You got a lot of familiar faces in this. You got William Sanders, you got Harry Turtledove, you got S.M. Sterling.
And some new ones, too.
It's
got a great cover before we start.
Oh, yeah. I guess that's the main thing. The main selling point of the book. You're looking in the bookstore and you see something really amazing. You see George Washington, but George Washington's wearing...
a World War II era general's uniform, like a Patton.
I mean, kind of, but he's got like a name tag on. I
Yeah.
mean, did they have name tags back then?
I don't know if they did. I don't think so.
He's wearing a polished helmet.
Kind of like the Patton polished helmet.
4 stars, I think. I think he's a 4. Let me check the cover. Yeah, that's a 4-star.
Yep, 4 stars, so he's a general. But it's George Washington. So, not sure how that one really works.
Isn't George Washington's actual rank a 6-star general?
Well, he is actually, they passed in the 70s a act of Congress, because apparently John Pershing, who we'll be talking about relatively soon, he got a rank that technically, I guess, made him outrank. He was like general of the armies, and that technically outranked Washington. So I think it was in 76 or 77, somewhere around the bicentennial, they passed an act that has made George Washington the highest ranking general ever, and that no one can ever be ranked higher than him. So like he's like General of the Armies of the United States or something like that is his posthumous title. He is equivalent of, I guess, a 5-star, but his date of rank is higher than any of the other 5 stars that existed during World War II. So he is the highest rank. No one will ever outrank Washington.
So if there's ever another 6-star general, he'll become a 7-star general.
Oh, 6-star general. The field marshals. We start having field marshals in the U.S. Army.
Space Marshal.
Space Marshal. Space Force.
In the Space Force, yes. But yeah, great cover. I especially love the story wherein this happens. Wasn't that a great story?
Oh, yes. What a great story. Again, Max, the possibilities are endless.
The possibilities are just endless. So another funny thing about that is, if you remember back in Alternate Generals 1, you looked at the back of the book and it had all this crap that wasn't in the book. Like, oh, what if Erwin Rommel was at Gaugamela and stuff like that. But now, in this version of the book, you open it up and you look at the inside leaf of it, and it's just explaining what the last book was and not really explaining what this one was. Just suppose, for example, General Billy Mitchell had not been court-martialed for advocating air power and happened to be leading a training flight of warplanes at Pearl Harbor in December 1941. It's like, oh yeah, I do remember that.
That's Billy Mitchell's overt act.
Right, exactly. I don't know. It's just really funny that they retroactively described the last book on the second book. And then the back is just praise for Harry Turtledove. And like, oh, the toxic spell dump is really good. Orson Scott Card, talented, ... fresh and original, period.
Yay.
Not talking about this book, but just in general. Agent of Byzantium, engrossing, entertaining, and very cleverly rendered. I recommend it without reservation, says Roger Zelazny.
Elsprague de Camp, agent of Byzantium. Elsprague de Camp died in like 1989. What?
I think they actually wrote a book together, believe it or not, down in the Bottomlands.
He's been writing since like the 70s, so yeah, that totally makes sense.
The two of them.
Well, we need to get to these stories. There's some good ones in here.
Yeah, enough beating around the bush. Let's get to the meat of the matter. So the first story in this compilation is American Mandate, written by Jim Fiscus. And this one's pretty darn cool.
This is an interesting one. So the basic premise is that the Ottoman Turks surrendered to the U.S. at the end of World War I rather than Germany. Britain or France.
Just surrendered to everybody.
They surrendered to everyone.
I'm so sorry. Surrendered to Japan.
So the United States becomes part of the League of Nations, apparently. They accept a League of Nations mandate for chunks of Turkey, and a U.S. force goes to Turkey. And then this flashes forward to at least 1921, if not later, because Warren Harding is the president.
Yeah.
My favorite president.
Our boy.
Warren.
Good old Gamaliel.
Gamaliel, yeah. What a great language you spoke. Gamalielese, according to H.L. Mencken. But the point is that Constantinople, this is probably roughly around 23 or 24 is my guess, or maybe a little bit earlier. But what you have is that Blackjack Pershing, John Pershing, is the head of the American forces there. And the civilian governor is a man by the name of Albert Fall.
Albert Bacon Fall, please.
That's right. Who you may know from a tragedy, an American tragedy.
Yes. The tragedy, really.
The tragedy of American history.
The Civil War, not a big deal. Who cares?
But that Teapot Dome scandal. And it relates in later. Basically, you have the USS Arizona. It gets sunk, spoiler alert, by what appears to be a submarine. And then you have this whole story of Smedley Butler, who was very famous during the interwar, especially in the 30s, for exposing the plot to overthrow Roosevelt, which is, we're not big conspiracy theorists here, but actually probably was a real conspiracy. He won the Medal of Honor twice before the First World War, and he's leading these Marine forces within Constantinople as they fight against the forces of Ataturk.
Mustafa
Kemal Ataturk. And they're right at the gates of Constantinople, and it mentions Dwight Eisenhower has been killed, and Omar Bradley's been injured or something like that.
Oh, right, I forgot about that.
George Patton gets shot by an old musket while playing polo, stuff like that. So the U.S. Army and Marines are barely holding on, and Ataturk has been talked about how Ataturk has defeated the Greeks in the Ionian area, and they're pushing towards Constantinople, and Pershing wants to leave the city, but Fall's like, no, we've got to stay, we've got to beat them up and get those oil concessions.
Eat that oil.
They eventually evacuate the Sultan, and Fall gets put under arrest, and they steam out. They destroy the submarine. There's like a commando mission in it. But what's really interesting is that the BAR and the Thompson play a very big role in this.
Fantastic. I like it.
And then at the end of it, they steam away, and it's like, fire a 21-gun salute for the new Turkey and for Ataturk.
Would that be the old-fashioned version of the Thompson before it was changed?
Yeah, well, that would be the one with the front foregrip. It would have a foregrip. They talk about having it drum magazines. It probably would have, the front of it, when you think of like the classic like Tommy gun, gangster Tommy gun, it has that interesting muzzle brake on the front. It would probably not look like that, because I think that's the M1928 version of the Thompson. Has that interesting muzzle brake that they eventually then dropped off in World War II, where you have like the regular looking Thompson that like Tom Hanks uses in, or a lot of the other people use in World War II movies. But this would be the original, kind of looks like the front of that, except it has that front foregrip on it.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And that's not an anachronism. Like the Thompson existed by about 1921. So first used really in the United States governmental service by the post office.
What?
The post service, yeah.
Stopping people from stealing from
for
trains?
mail trains. Taking the mail. How dare you?
Amazon Prime, PMCs, Blackwater.
But this is a good story. I really like it. It's very fast paced.
Yeah.
It's a good story. It's an interesting divergence, putting the U.S. and Turkey and the U.S. in the League of Nations. Is that the Legion of Nations?
The Legion of Nations. The 12 legions of nations.
Yeah, so I've talked enough, Max. What do you think?
Albert Bacon Fall says the N-word a whole bunch of times in reference to Blackjack Pershing because he was a commander of black troops.
10th Cavalry in San Juan Hill.
San Juan Hill? Really?
Kettle Hill. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Yeah.
Wow.
That's how Pershing, he really jumped in the ranks because he knew Teddy Roosevelt. Pretty sure about that. But long story short, this is a good story. I really enjoyed this one. Really interesting, fast-paced, cool divergence. You know, the only thing I wish is that it would have played out the implications of this, because this obviously has got to have some long-term implications. They're interesting. But
all the corruption, perhaps? Maybe endangering the Harding administration, perhaps?
Maybe, but I'm thinking more like toward the World War II era.
Oh, please. That's not interesting at all. Oh.
Yeah. Our viewers demand knowledge about oil concessions.
But yes, you're right in regard to World War II. Well, funny story, I think we might have mentioned this before, but originally the Sykes-Picot Agreement was the Sykes-Picot and a Russian guy. I can't remember his name. But the original plan was to give Imperial Russia both Constantinople and the Straits, all of it.
Wow.
After World War I, which would have been crazy, absolutely crazy.
That'd been a Russian goal for a long time.
After all, that's kind of like the seat of the Orthodox Church, you know?
Well, the patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church, I think, is still based out of Constantinople.
There's like Constantinople, Alexandria, and
the Metropolitan of Moscow.
Yeah.
But then there's other Orthodox. The Orthodox churches have lots of prelates all over the place. There's like the Antiochian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, and all sorts of stuff.
The Oriental Orthodox Church.
I think so.
I think that's
the
what
Ethiopian
they call
Orthodox Church.
Well, that's almost a different thing. The Taekwondo or whatever, because it's a little different.
They're all different.
They don't wear shoes in church, and they segregate men and women. It's very interesting, though.
Yeah. So this story, very good, very enjoyable. And I like that the divergence is not buried. Sometimes these stories will bury the divergence kind of far in. The first sentence, it's like the first paragraph talks about it. So you can get right to it.
Right. The second story has more League of Nations goodness.
Oh, good.
I really got to say, I love this story. It's fantastic. Southern Strategy by Michael Flynn. It's an Adlai Stevenson story.
Our man Adlai.
Too smart to be president. Just too damn smart.
Maybe not here, but we'll get to that.
Definitely not smart enough to be president in this story. So the story takes place in the 1950s, but the divergence happens way earlier. It's so after World War I, the United States, kind of like the last story, decides to join the League of Nations. And as members of the League of Nations, if you're a member of the League of Nations, according to this story, I don't know if this is true, but you submit to have your country be
subject to intervention.
Yes.
If the other members deem it appropriate.
Your internal affairs can be decided by the League of Nations, which is a big reason why the Senate and the House didn't want to approve it.
Mm-hmm. And I think, too, part of this is that the divergence, it's not just that the U.S. joins the League of Nations, it's that I think the story hints that the U.S. never actually joined the first... No, it doesn't hint to say that. They never joined the First World War. Mm-hmm. So, and it gets negotiated, sort of, I think Wilson negotiates the end of the First World War, but the U.S. joins the League of Nations instead of joining the war. So, basically, I guess it hints at that almost like a race war erupts in the southern United States in the 50s. It's called the Clearings. Yeah. And the League of Nations involves itself. So you have German and other troops come to the southern United States to restore order.
Yes, the story takes place in Alabama, more specifically Selma, I think, for pretty much the entire thing. So there's all these German checkpoints all over the place. Mm-hmm. And there's some cheeky jokes about, like, in Europe, we're civilized and we would never have such mad killing, not like you barbaric Americans. And the guy running the checkpoint is a Jewish German guy, which is like showing just how the world is so radically different.
So, and what happens here is that Adlai Stevenson is a politician from the Democratic Party in the northern part of the United States, and he's come down south to figure out a way to unite the Democratic Party to try and get through this because of the dislocation. Hugo Black is president.
Yes,
who was a famous Supreme Court justice and
former member of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's true, which caused a big ruckus in the 1930s.
Yes. Interesting story. I was talking to my grandfather earlier today, and I actually mentioned this particular story. I talked about how Hugo Black was president of the United States in it, and he told me about how one of his good friends, who is in a care facility at the moment because they're quite old, she and another woman were working in the U.S. government. They were like WACs or something, WACs, female personnel in the military. And they would take the bus every day from Northern Virginia into Washington, D.C. during World War II. And one day, this older man in a car pulled up and said, "Hey, do you ladies want to ride? Because I notice you every day waiting for the bus. I'm happy to drive you into D.C." And that guy was Hugo Black.
Whoa,
and
what?
They did this like every day. Every weekday, Hugo Black would show up and drive them to work.
That's incredible.
Well, carpooling.
That was a big thing back then. They encouraged that.
When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. So
I guess so.
Ride with Hugo Black instead.
Yeah. Very famous for big on the incorporation of all the Bill of Rights, all that sort of thing on
free
the states.
Speech.
Yeah. But, someone who was a conventional politician who eventually came out on the Supreme Court. But here, there's an interesting thing about how they mentioned how FDR was president when the Depression starts.
Yes.
America needs a savior, and who comes and saves them, Max?
Why a Mr. Herbert Hoover and his good friend Charles Curtis come in to save the U.S. from the horrific mismanagement of a Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I love that. That's fantastic. You know me. You know what I like.
Yeah. So,
but it kind of doesn't make sense because like the Democrats are still in charge and they're still winning a lot of elections, but I don't know why, because the Depression happened under FDR, and then this occupation happens, I think, underneath the Democrat president.
The Depression started on the Republicans, but eventually Republicans were elected to become president later. So, I mean...
That's true. It is the 50s, so a lot of time has passed.
By 53, the Republicans in history had a person elected, so why not in this world that there's some sort of recovery?
That's true. That's true.
And there is a hint that there was sort of a World War II fought. But it was mainly against the Japanese, and it talks about like the German troops like fought in Tokyo and all sorts of stuff.
Oh yeah, that's right. But they were like fighting with the League of Nations or something?
Like against Japan. It's like a war by the European powers against Japan. Very interesting.
I forgot about that. Yeah, they name drop a couple different places. But
Tokyo and Manila, I feel like, were mentioned.
Yeah.
So, but basic plan is that Stevenson comes down to try and unite this. The Democratic Party come up with this strategy, Southern strategy.
Oh my goodness, yes. Because George Wallace is like a mover and shaker in the South.
He's the Attorney General of Alabama.
Yes.
Basically a member of the Ku Klux Klan.
They call it the Night Riders, no relation to the TV show.
I don't think they had sentient cars.
Or Mad Max 1, remember? That guy who says he's the Night Rider. And
is that the bad guy?
No, that's Toe Cutter. Toe Cutter's the main bad guy.
Who then became the bad guy in Mad Max Fury Road.
That's precisely correct. His hair was much better in Mad Max 1, though. Look at him. But no, the like random bad guy who dies in like the first 10 minutes of the first Mad Max movie is called the Night Rider.
Oh.
But anyway, George Wallace, yeah, he's got this organization that wants to get rid of the League of Nations occupiers, but they're also kind of like the Klan in that they're very segregationist and, a white supremacist organization, basically.
So, yeah, Stevenson's trying to cut a deal, and it seems like, there's just all this confusion going on, and they talk about King's people, who are causing trouble, and they also talk about how there's a guy named Tricky Dick who's causing a lot of trouble down there.
Yes. And King, they mentioned King this, King that. And it's revealed to be a person who in our timeline is Martin Luther King. Yeah. But he's not named Martin Luther King.
John Calvin King.
John Calvin King. I love it.
Yeah.
A different Protestant reformer.
Yes, that's right. A little bit more extreme almost, you could say, than Luther.
Right.
So yeah, John Calvin King, and he eventually runs into King, and he talks with him, and he comments about how, like, what a great speaker he is, and if only he had more education, he could be a real inspirational person, but instead he's carrying, like, an over-under shotgun, and,
But he does have some education because he quotes John Calvin, because he talks about predestination, and then quotes Thomas Hobbes, and he says, Calvin and Hobbes? He's like, oh my God, this guy.
No.
Oh my God. There's so many little jokes all over the place. The jokes are just...
They don't laugh a minute.
Like every 3 sentences, there's a punchline. I mean, I like it. I enjoy it.
And it turns into kind of this, like, sort of almost mystery, trying to figure out where's Tricky Dick? What's Tricky Dick up to and all this? And Elvis Presley makes an appearance as, like, a busboy. And then finally, he finds Tricky Dick. And it is Richard Nixon.
Yes. He was the bartender all along. This guy he had talked to several times before. God, it's just completely insane because at the end he's talking to the guy and he's like, of course, I'm Richard Nixon. I planned all of this out ahead of time, and you fell for all of it. I played you like a fiddle. Because like he sets up George Wallace to get raided by the police, and he gets shot and paralyzed, just like in our world. In addition to that, he like manipulated Adlai Stevenson into sending a note to Rommel saying the bartender at such and such hotel is actually Tricky Dick. Come and arrest him. And he talks to him for quite some time. And eventually he does a sleight of hand and like handcuffs him to the bar and then puts a apron on him. And he's like, see you later, haha, and then goes down through a trap door. And then as he's handcuffed to the bar, Rommel is riding down the street and an improvised explosive device blows up and kills him. And a bunch of German soldiers walk into the hotel and they've got guns up and they've been told that the bartender is this terrorist, and he tries to raise his hands to surrender, but the sound of the chains make a sound like a pistol cocking.
Uh-oh.
And oh God, it's great. It's just, it's completely
So it's not
ridiculous.
Dwight Eisenhower putting an end to Adlai Stevenson's dreams now.
It's just so absurd. It's the most absurd thing I've ever.
It's a good story, though. It's
Yeah.
lengthy. It's kind of lengthy, but it's good.
Yeah. A lot of, I mean, of course, it's not plausible at all.
No,
It's
of course
totally insane.
No.
But
although the U.S. not joining World War I, kind of hard to buy. The U.S. joining the League of Nations, that's easier to accept. I mean, it came relatively close. And he talks about how the British and the French are kind of bitter that the U.S. never joined them. Talk about the triple monarchy troops.
Yeah,
which
what
I
the
guess
heck is that?
I guess it's Austria-Hungary and probably something else on top of it.
maybe, well, Germany is another monarchy.
Yeah, but they're not joined because the German troops are separate.
Oh, I see.
Maybe it's Serbia.
Serbia, and Albania. King Zog.
Yeah, King Zog's back.
King Zog the Second.
Now, this is a good story. I like it.
Yeah. The next story is called Uncle Alf by Harry Turtledove.
Yep. Not about Alf Landon, though.
Too bad, really. Now, that would be quite a story.
President Alf Landon unites the country, defeats Nazi Germany, and the U.S. conquers the world.
But no, the Alf in question is Adolf Hitler. Mm-hmm. And it's like a world where Germany won the First World War, and they're occupying at least part of France.
Yeah,
maybe the whole
Lille,
thing.
at least in the northern part of France, near the Belgian border. But that's kind of close up to the English Channel, or Lille, I guess is how it's supposed to be.
And Hitler is tasked with infiltrating this organization, this kind of anti-German organization that's also kind of like a left-wing Marxist kind of group. Mm-hmm. And the leader of it is, I don't really know how to pronounce this.
Jacques Doriot.
Doriot? Okay.
Nice.
I think he ended up becoming some kind of fascist in the French government later. But originally he was a Marxist, and in this story he is still.
He remains a Marxist.
Yeah.
So Hitler, it's written. This is an epistolary form. It's all letters Hitler is sending to his niece. Probably, I would guess, is Gaily Raubel, who is his niece, who he had a bizarre relationship with, that people can't really confirm or deny. But here, Harry's getting his hits in on and Hitler. Not that anyone really cares, but I mean, he's like writes some really perverted, weird stuff that he's saying.
He comes off as a bit of a weirdo in this story. Yeah.
That's to say the least. But and it's just basically recounting a world in which World War I was lost by the Allies.
Yeah. At the end, Hitler's like, I've busted this guy. I've done all this good stuff. Now I'm coming home to you. It's just creepy.
Yeah. But it's very good. It's a perfectly good story. And
yeah, I think I like Turtledove's story from the last compilation a little bit better, but this is fine.
Yeah,
It's
fine.
good.
Fine.
The next one is another Ankenaten story.
See, this is an area of history I'm very weak in.
Me too.
I did not enjoy this one as much because it references stuff that I'm just not as familiar with.
Yeah, like I kind of wrote down some stuff. Like they talk about the kingdom of Kizuwadna and King Sapilolioma and Mursili. And it's just, I don't know any of this stuff. This is complete gibberish to me.
Yeah. I mean, ancient Egypt is fascinating. Like, I know some stuff broadly about it, but not to the degree that I could really appreciate this.
Yeah.
I mean, I saw the movie The Mummy and The
true.
Mummy Returns, so that's really enough of a primer on Egyptian history.
But did you see the Tom Cruise Mummy movie?
I only saw that trailer.
The trailer, okay.
I couldn't bear to watch that movie. I was very busy at that time as well doing other stuff, but
Yeah, that's kind of a problem. I mean, Akhenaten's interesting, And Akhenaten is such a weird little footnote, and it's connected to Tutankhamun, which people know about. Weirdly, this totally irrelevant pharaoh.
Yeah, who did nothing. I do know that. He's like has no real impact on.
The only reason people care about him is because they found his tomb completely intact.
Which is so much different.
Because apparently his tomb is supposedly not a very fancy one compared to like the ridiculous,
What was in the pyramids, I'm sure. Or something
like who can even say?
Well, we don't know because all the other ones got pillaged.
Yeah.
Yeah, that Egypt is fascinating. That it's a really quite an advanced culture, and what an old one too.
Yeah.
Like the pyramids were built in I can't even guess the time, but they were ancient by the time of Alexander the Great. They were ancient. I think Herodotus, who is not exactly the best source of information about stuff, even he commented truthfully that they were impossibly ancient even by then.
There's kind of a problem, I think, with alternate history and these really, really old stories, is that they just seem so ridiculously alien to us. And it's hard to write a story like this where it just doesn't seem entirely strange and weird. Oh, Horemheb and all these people, and like they act so strangely, and they don't even act like human beings, and you don't know.
Well, I think like Rome stories you can get away with a little bit more because people more familiarity. Stories involving like ancient Greece, probably because they stick in our minds more. But I think people know about ancient Egypt. But if you're writing about like the Hittites or ancient Babylon,
it's like what is this?
I mean, interest good for you, but like this is not something that's very much accessible to most people, unless you're vigorously checking Wikipedia and other sources throughout.
Because like with Rome, you know about the baths, you know about the things they wear, the classes, people in the public consciousness, people know about all aspects of
the glory that was Rome.
But
you can even go see their sites. Go to
Yeah.
Italy, see their sites. Go to England, see their sites. If you're ever in Bath, go to the Roman baths in Bath, England. Been there, and they're really, really interesting. And also, if you're in England, there's not that many extant Roman stuff. But I mean, you go to Italy, it's all over the place, but differently. But it's, I mean, I guess the story's fine, but like it's just hard to really appreciate it because, I mean, I'm sure there's some like classicists or people who really like ancient history are like, what are you talking about? This stuff is amazing, which it is interesting, but I mean, maybe we're victims of like the way they taught ancient history in school, but
well, I mean, part of the problem is that ancient history, there's so few sources. Like you want to talk about the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. There's two sources. There's the Bible, which talks about it, and then there's an Assyrian stele of Sennacherib that talks about it, and that's it. That's like all there is. That's all anybody knows about it. It's so hard to get in depth about ancient stuff because, one, there's so few sources, and two, they're so hard to verify. Like, I've heard somebody make the argument that guys like Nero and Caligula and whatnot may not have been as bad as history say.
I've heard that exact same thing. I'm glad you brought that up because, what do we think about? Like Nero and Caligula, you read this stuff and people are just like, oh, he was sleeping with his sister and he made his horse the consul, fiddled his Rome burned, and going in the streets and raping and murdering people as they go. I read that somewhere too, that especially Caligula, they even focus on that, is that it may be one of the best examples of the victors. I mean, not saying, I'm not arguing that Caligula was like the greatest person ever and that people just, I don't even know, maybe he was just as terrible, but there's some historians who have argued that their enemies may have poison penned them into like complete hatred, whereas they may not have been as bad as they were made out to be.
I think,
or they may have been. They probably were pretty bad.
Yeah, if you're a Roman emperor, you're probably a pretty,
Joaquin Phoenix-esque,
a very indulgent person.
Oh yeah. Well, and no one's saying that they were great, but it's sort of like if you erase the person from history and then write what you have. Once living memory dies out, I mean, how are we really to contest those sources unless there's other, but the thing is Rome so dominated the area, it wasn't like an ambassador from another country there who could have written a more maybe, honest description. It's like, what sources do we have? Roman. It's the whole Mediterranean is Roman. It's not like today where we have more written sources that could maybe contradict or change how that goes. So maybe Nero and Caligula maybe they were doing bad stuff like killing their rivals, but maybe they weren't defacing Vestal virgins and doing all sorts of other stuff.
Right, right. I mean, I have the perfect example of this. In the Byzantine Empire, there was Emperor Justinian, and he had a court historian named Procopius. And Procopius wrote 3 totally normal vanilla histories of Justinian, talking about, the buildings of Justinian and the wars of Justinian and stuff. And they're completely normal. But there was this other history that I think they found in the Vatican archives in like the mid 1800s or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's called The Secret History. And it's this completely absurd, just total character assassination of Justinian and Theodora and Belisarius, just talking about how horrible they are and what awful people they are and stuff like that.
And get away from my Belisarius. How dare you?
And at first you might think, okay, this is the real story. This is what they were really like. But it's like completely absurd, the things they talk about. One of the chapters is called How Justinian Killed 1 Trillion People.
Okay.
And all these lewd stories about Theodora, like how Theodora had sex with a goose. And it's like, this obviously did not happen.
Yeah.
One of them is how Justinian and Theodora were fiends in human form. And like, Justinian's his head detached from his body and floated around the room. I don't think that really happened.
Doubtful.
But like, imagine if the vanilla histories were lost.
God was lost.
And this was the only one that existed. People would talk about, Justinian's one of the worst despots ever, and he's so terrible. And it's this... It's such a narrow selection, whereas you want to talk about, the Italian campaign in World War II. There's a billion sources of information.
Yeah. Well, and I think as literacy is spread and as more things are preserved, the common people can write about stuff and other things. And you could have, let's say you're talking about, one person wanted to argue about the Italian campaign in one way from the Allied perspective and another from the German perspective. Well, also you could have had correspondents from, I don't know, neutral countries like Sweden or Spain who were there, who then you could kind of maybe come in the middle of it. Mm-hmm. I mean, and it was something I was reading this recently about how people in England would oftentimes listen to these propaganda broadcasts, Lard ha-ha and all that sort of thing. Not because they were just entertained by like the craziness of some of them, but they were actually trying to get a better view, like a more balanced view, because obviously each side's, everyone, it would be nothing but victories. And it's like, if we're winning nothing but victories, why are we retreating? So you listen to the other side to maybe get a little bit of balance to that. So, but if there's nothing else, if there's one source, then we have to piece together what we can from archaeology or whatever, or hope you can find another source, or hope you can find something hidden away in an archive somewhere or in a private collection that really talks about sort of things like that. I mean, there are, what is it that they find? I know they've had this with some of the biblical stuff. They occasionally, obviously the Dead Sea Scrolls were huge. Yeah. But imagine the whole world of ancient Egypt, if not for the fact that someone found the Rosetta Stone, if it just remained buried in sand, the chances are it may have been very difficult to have ever figured out how to translate it, because no one before could. I mean, there's no recordings of anyone before whatever French guy translated it, whatever French doctor or professor did it, that anyone could figure it out, and it may have been lost forever. So stuff like that. So lack of sources. So maybe they really weren't as bad, or maybe they were. Who knows?
It's also just gutting to think about how many old texts have been lost. Like the
Library of Alexandria, what we lost there.
I mean, that Library of Alexandria was lost like 5 times.
Yeah.
There's no one time it was lost. But I mean, like specifically Greek tragedy. We only know less than half of the quote unquote great Greek tragedies.
Maybe even less than that.
There's so many that are referenced. There's some medieval sources talking about these plays that we don't know anything about because they were never preserved. Or so there's the Iliad, the Odyssey, but there's a third epic which talked about like the Trojan horse and stuff. The Trojan horse is not in the Iliad or the Odyssey. It's only the Aeneid, which was written way later by Virgil, talks about the Trojan horse and all this stuff. And he's taking info from that third lost epic.
Really? I didn't know about that. Maybe. I thought they talked about it in the Iliad.
No, they don't. They don't. It's just the Wrath of Achilles. That's what it's all about, is the Wrath of Achilles and,
So there's a book in between the Iliad and the Odyssey?
Pretty much, or like parallel to them or whatever. And the Aeneid is all about Aeneas, who's a Trojan guy who leaves and goes and basically has a family, and that family ends up becoming Romulus and Remus through the generations.
It's sort of like the idea of the Q document. Have you ever heard about that?
Yeah, that there's another biblical source.
That there's another source, and that they've really broken this down. I mean, people devoted their whole lives to figuring this sort of stuff out. And it's like, where is it pulling from? And that they've managed to figure out, I guess, and I'm not an expert on theology or an expert on biblical literature, but that this Q document is responsible for probably something like 60%. And they figured out, I think, is it Mark is the oldest, then Matthew, followed by Luke, and then John is the new. But I mean, there's sort of all this, but they reference things that we don't have access to. Then you have these other lost gospels or gospels that were left out, and all sorts of the Gospel of Thomas or whatever. There's stuff that they found, the Codex Sinaiticus that they found at a monastery in the Sinai, and all sorts of stuff. So
the Gospel of Judas.
Yes, I guess that was found. I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, it's just crazy.
Shows and then thinks about all the other stuff that we've lost access to because it's been lost throughout the ages. And stuff that we don't, that's not referenced in literature. At least we know about this third work that probably existed because of where the Aeneid is pulling from. Other stuff that is just so completely lost that we have no access to it.
Yeah, it's so maddening and frustrating to even think about how many gigantic holes there are in historical understanding.
I mean, the way we record history, I mean, there's going to be huge holes even for what we've produced. I mean, imagine all of the literature our society's produced. There's movies that were made like about 100 years ago or even less that are lost.
Yes.
There are many movies from the silent film era that we know existed because we have records that show they existed, but we don't have any copies of them.
One of the first horror movies ever made, London After Midnight, with Lon Chaney Sr., is lost. There's stills of it. There's stills of the creepy monster guy, but the movie's totally gone.
Yeah. And these things have been lost. And a lot of newspaper, I mean, I think this is why they're trying to digitize stuff, is that a lot of the paper that we use in printing now, unless it's like really high quality newspaper stuff, that's gone after about a century, I think. It just, the acidity of it just eats away. So if it's not digitized, I mean, maybe there's some stuff we don't really need to preserve. I don't know. Do we need every pulp novel ever written to be preserved? But
right. Every shipping manifest for every
that's true
convoy that ever went in World War II.
If another culture ever follows us, what will we have left? I thought it was really interesting. One of the few things I got out of those History Channel, like Life After People or whatever, after they apparently decided that history wasn't interesting enough, we should talk about ice road trucks and aliens. They had like a Life
and
After
gold.
People.
And gold mining.
Yes, that's what the people want. Pawn stars. But they really want is Cajun Pawn stars.
I'm Rick Harrison. I want to show just about Big Hoss. Give me the Chumley lockup episodes. Talking about Chumley.
Right. But point is they had the Life After People thing. The interesting thing they said is that what will last the longest, like let's say human civilization just ends today for some reason, what will be the longest lasting memorial to our society? Some species comes to Earth later, some aliens. What is left of human society? And the things they said that will last the longest are the pyramids and Mount Rushmore.
What?
Because they're made out of stone, like buildings and stuff overtaken. They're in relatively geologically stable areas, particularly Mount Rushmore, not near any fault lines. It's stone. The natural weathering process would take thousands of years. I mean, the pyramid's just a bunch of big stones.
Yeah.
And those are what will be left. And it's funny to think that the pyramids have lasted this long, but they could very well outlast
everything. Yeah. Huh.
Because like modern buildings would be gone after about 50 years. I mean, without upkeep, without anything, they get overtaken by nature eventually. I mean, look what happened in like the Chernobyl area. Stuff's getting overgrown already, and it's 30 years later.
Pripyat. Yeah.
But yeah, interesting stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good story. It's kind of lost on me and you.
Yeah, and that's the problem. It's just, it doesn't have enough impact. But doesn't mean it's bad. It's just, you just have to have a level of knowledge about this sort of stuff that I don't think either of us have ever had. I can certainly speak for myself. I've never had.
And there is a general in this story, Horemheb. So it qualifies to be in alternate generals too.
Cool.
The next one, this is kind of a cool story. Devil's Bargain by Judith Tarr. And it's a Crusader story.
Richard the Lionheart. And this is interesting because he's outside of Jerusalem during the Third Crusade, and Saladin gets murdered by an assassin.
Yes, Hashishin.
Yeah. eventually the assassins come to meet Richard, and they make him an offer about they'll let him take Jerusalem if he gives them free reign, and they eventually take the city, and then eventually Richard reneges on the deal and kills them.
Kills the old man in the mountain.
Yeah.
Who was a real guy.
Yes,
His name was Rashid
Ad-Din Sinan, I think.
Yeah.
This is we've written it.
He was a Ismaili
Shiite, yes.
Yeah.
And they were based out of somewhere in what's northern Iran now.
But they had a couple castles in Syria that they had wrested control of and were operating out of. Such a strange thing. I think people kind of embellish it a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely do, because it's weird and interesting.
Yeah, like Marco Polo talks about it, and probably not 100% true. The things he talks about, apparently, the whole they're called assassins because they smoke hashish thing is not true, and but it's still such a strange thing that this was a kind of like a third party force during the crusade, which was killing both crusaders and also what's the word they use for them? Saracens,
yeah, that was interesting. And it brings up another interesting person who's Richard the Lionheart, which is fascinating because when people think of, there's a big statue of him in front of Parliament, Richard the Lionheart, this great English king. He didn't really do anything for like England. And what's so interesting is that if you watch The Monarchy, that English show we've talked about before, which is so good, what a great series. I really like those. The one that was on Netflix was the best because it's the British version that actually goes in depth, because the American version, which you can find online on YouTube, is like much more compressed and not as in depth. And for a history nut like me, I like the broader stuff. But it's funny, in that show, they don't really talk about Richard the Lionheart because he had no real impact on England, like its economy or anything like that. Because he spent basically the entire time outside of England.
Right.
A strange figure. He's in the movie Robin Hood with Russell Crowe before he gets killed.
Oh, really? Oh, is he the guy who gets shot in the neck?
Yeah, he gets shot in the neck with the crossbow. So how he really died.
What a film.
Yeah.
Just raiding some random castle on the way.
Yeah,
home.
well, no, he was campaigning in France. He gets shot by a crossbow, and it's interesting, the story behind that, because there's different stories. Some say it was like a chef, some sort of peasant guy who shot him. Others say it was a boy, a peasant boy, basically, who apparently, the story was, they was holding up a pan and knocking away arrows, and Richard was like, ha, ha, ha. All they can send is boys against us, and whoever this was shot him with a crossbow, and it hit him in the shoulder, and apparently the story is that Richard said, take mercy upon him, spare him, here, give him this money and let him go.
His blood is gurgling out of his mouth.
Some people have said, well, he died. He didn't die immediately.
Okay.
The arrow caused an infection that killed him. It wasn't like a kill shot.
All right.
Is that a kill shot? Well, I don't know until I talk with Dr. Armandorian. But once we consult with him, we'll get back to you. Kill shot or not. No, but apparently he told him, like, spare the boy, spare the boy. And there's stories, some say they let him go. Other ones say he was flayed alive by Richard's soldiers, which that one may be more believable. But either way, Richard the Lionheart, interesting character. And really this warrior king who didn't really do a whole lot. Probably didn't even speak English like most of the kings of the time.
Well, yeah. There's a movie, A Lion in Winter.
The Lion in Winter, which is a famous... But that's really about his father, Henry II, and his mother, Eleanor Aquitaine. And his older brother died before he became king. Then Richard became king. And then John became king after that.
Which is the Robin Hood John.
Well, yeah. Yeah, that Robin Hood John, played by Oscar Isaac. The guy from the new... All I remember...
Star Wars,
Yeah, I remember, if I'm remembering this correctly, there's a scene in that movie where he's talking to his mother, then stands up and he's like naked and his like crotch is right in front of her face. That's weird. But
gosh.
the thing is that King Richard the Lionheart shows up in the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves movie with that excellent English accent by Kevin Costner. And Sean Connery plays him. And then Patrick Stewart parodies him in the movie Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Yes.
Which is a really good movie,
Fine
actually.
film.
A more enjoyable film, certainly.
Yes.
So, kind of a tangent here.
Possibly more historically accurate, I don't know.
Honestly.
No.
Well, I didn't know
No.
the California surfer dialect made it into England. Dave Chappelle is in Robin Hood Men in Tights.
He's also in Con Air.
He is. We've talked about that one before.
That's true.
But we haven't talked about him being in Robin Hood Men in Tights, where he's like, gotta put air in my sneakers, and he fights the guys. He's Achu.
Yes, Achu. Morgan Freeman's character, basically, from
Sort of, yeah.
kind of.
Carrie Yules, I like that in the movie. He just turns to the screen and does a breaking the fourth wall and goes, unlike some Robin Hoods, I can speak in a British accent.
He's also in The Princess Bride.
He is.
A fine actor.
Yeah.
Not in much else after those two films.
He was in Glory.
He was?
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's a real film. Morgan Freeman's also in that film.
Mm-hmm. But is it as good as Gods and Generals, Max?
I don't know.
I think so.
I wonder what Ted Turner thinks. We should ask him. He's the ultimate arbiter.
Expert, yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe if they could remake Glory and they can have the guy who played Stonewall Jackson, he can be the Morgan Freeman character.
Right. Yes. He can be anyone in the Civil War, apparently. The shapeshifter who keeps from Pickett to Stonewall to that guy.
Good stuff. Well, what do we have next?
One last thing before we move on to the next one. So part of the story in here is that, it's about the assassins and about the old man in the mountain. And it's kind of funny because this organization is kind of like most people, I think young people know about this organization because of the video game series Assassin's Creed, which is completely bonkers. Like the whole series is completely insane. Ostensibly, the idea behind the whole series is that there's two different warring secret societies. There's Templars and Assassins. And they were fighting each other during the Crusades, but they've actually been fighting each other throughout all of human history since the very, very beginning. And the very, very beginning of human history, Matt, was when ancient aliens created humankind.
Really?
As a slave race. Yes.
Is that really?
Yes, really.
Oh.
That's the big secret behind the whole
really?
series. Yes.
Oh, see, I lost track of it after the Renaissance one.
All the gods of the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians and stuff were not actually gods. They were ancient aliens with not magical, but like these artifacts which could control people's minds and stuff. Basically, in the series, human beings are dumb, drooling sheep. And throughout all of history, there's been a small cabal of people using ancient alien artifacts to shape history throughout all time. And literally everything that has ever happened in history was one of these two groups controlling things. Nobody ever did anything by themselves. It's so silly.
It's so dumb. And the movie is so bad.
I remember the day you saw that film, you asked me if I wanted to come along, and I couldn't, unfortunately. And I really dodged a bullet, I think.
You did. Oh, you dodged an artillery shell.
So there were no ancient aliens in the film?
Well, no, Jeremy Irons was in that movie. Brendan Gleeson. Mm-hmm. Michael Fassbender.
Fassbender, yes.
I mean, it was just, I remember watching it and going, man, that's 2 hours of my life that I could never have back. Stolen from me. What happened? Why?
It's like a Spanish Inquisition movie, isn't it?
Yeah, Torquemada is in it. Alonso Tomas de Torquemada, or whatever it is.
I don't know who that is.
The High Inquisitioner. Very famous. He was one of the leaders of the Spanish Inquisition. Famous from the movie History of the World Part 2, where they do the, hey there, Torquemada, what do you say? Torquemada, you can't Torquemada anything. That Mel Brooks.
It's good to be the king.
Yeah, God, it's good to be the king. It's a great movie.
Jews in space. What a film.
Assassin's Creed. Now I hate it even more.
Yeah.
Man, I hate it even more. Don't they have one where George Washington, like alternate history, where George Washington becomes like a bad guy?
Yeah, that's like a DLC or whatever. Like they have Assassin's Creed 3, which is the American Revolution. And of course, because like everyone's a bad guy in this series. Everyone who's like a famous person is actually a secret master manipulator. I hate that whole conspiracy theory idea that everyone's mind controlled and I just think that that's such a cynical view of history, that absolutely everything is just a big manipulation trick.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm not big on conspiracy theory things, as we mentioned before. I mean, here's the thing: is that obviously you don't take everything at face value that anyone's ever said. You just can't believe everything you ever hear. But I think a lot of conspiracy theory stuff is so exaggerated, and frankly,
Yeah.
if you're going to make a proposition like that, you need to have some evidence to back it up. And there are real conspiracies, as I talked about, that conspiracy thing involving Roosevelt. There actually is pretty good evidence that people really were kind of plotting towards that.
Like, absolutely. There's been groups of people who have plotted to do stuff, influential people trying to manipulate world events. Look at the British Empire, all the Great Game, all that stuff they did. Let's send an expedition into Tibet. There's a really good case that Felix Yusupov was working with British intelligence when he killed Rasputin.
Yes. No. Oh, Max. Wow. I was just reading about this earlier this week, and there's some people who claim there's decent evidence that it was actually an agent of the British military intelligence who killed him, who actually was the one who killed Rasputin, who shot him in the head. And actually, that's true. That there's. I even watched something with some documentary, and it was on a respectable channel. It wasn't like some crazy thing on the internet. Like it was on
Right.
I think it was on Discovery or wherever, where they talked about. There's pretty good evidence that Rasputin, the whole story about Rasputin, being poisoned and then being dragged down and then shot twice, and then they had to beat him up with crowbars, and then they shot him again because he was running away, and then they had to dump him in the river, and he still was clawing his way out of the canvas bag before he died, is at best an exaggeration, at worst may not have even happened. That they may have just shot him a couple times, including a pretty close gunshot wound to like the middle of his forehead. Even if you, in the documentary pointed out, look at his forehead in his like autopsy picture. It clearly appears to be a bullet hole in the middle of it. Like the whole thing. And I mean, some people disagree. The book I was reading, the book's claim, the whole thing wasn't about this, but their claim was that the whole thing about beating him up was all an exaggeration and they just shot him.
Right.
I mean, there probably was some, but the thing about poisoning the cakes and then baking it, the book made the point about that probably would have like vaporized the poison and would have killed everyone in there. So, and also that apparently Rasputin had been injured by a prostitute a couple years before who thought he was like the Antichrist or something like that, and he had issues with his stomach that he couldn't really eat sweet foods. So I don't know. I need to read more about it, more in depth, but. Yeah, stuff like that. And Yusupov, the guy who was like the British military liaison there at the time, was someone who knew Yusupov from college. So, and his driver kept records that indicated that this guy was seeing Yusupov on a regular basis. Stuff like that. Also, Yusupov, before we forget, if you ever see at the end of a movie, any resemblance to persons real is merely a coincidence. They made a movie about Rasputin in which there was Yusupov. They changed the name, but nothing else really about him. And he sued and won a massive settlement, like a 25,000 pound settlement in like the 30s. And because of that, they started to add those in because they didn't used to have those. Long tangent, sorry.
But like the idea that there's like a secret cabal who's coherently working throughout all of history and has total control is obviously not true.
They've done a bad job about it too. If they,
The British Empire is still pulling all the strings.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, conspiracy theories are fascinating in that way, but a lot of sometimes it's just no basis, and conspiratorial thinking can become very dangerous.
There's a lot of Persian expatriates who think that the Ayatollah was an MI6 agent, that he's actually a Sikh and he's from India and he's not actually Persian or Muslim at all, and that the Iranian Revolution was just a big, somehow master long con by the British.
But how is it helping them, though? That's the thing, is if it's
question.
a conspiracy by them, why is it helping them?
I don't know.
But yeah, but that's you have to use some rational thinking. And conspiracy theories are sometimes the voice of people who feel voiceless or feel like they're not being heard. Yeah. But the thing about it is like sometimes it seems like goofy and kind of stupid, but conspiracy theories can become deadly. Some of the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that the Nazis put forward become deadly. I mean, you look at the way people talk about Jews in the Middle East sometimes, and it is concerning. Stuff like that. And then talking about that, some other crazy conspiracy theories that come out of that are those involving the Israelis and animals.
Yeah, there's this ongoing conspiracy theory that Israeli intelligence uses animals, can mind control animals to use them to their own benefit. And the explanation is that they keep finding these animals with tags that say University of Tel Aviv,
like
or
birds
whatever.
and stuff, like migratory birds.
in Egypt, there was a bunch of shark attacks, and they killed this shark, and it had a tag that said University of Tel Aviv, and it's like, oh my God, they're mind controlling this shark to kill people. And it's like, no.
You've watched too many movies.
No.
Or the bird, some bird, I think it was in Turkey or Syria, I can't remember, had one of those University of Tel Aviv tags on it.
Yeah.
It's like a vulture or something, and they like detain the bird as a spy, and it's like, it's a bird, for God's sakes. Conspiracy theories there are oftentimes more to events than people realize, but
yes.
But to think that everything, unfortunately, I think movies have a big part in this because everything's a big conspiracy and the tentacles just extend everywhere and blah, blah, blah. Everyone else is saying, oh, what you're talking about is crazy. And there's the one person who tends to be the hero who is right the whole time, I think reinforces bad ways of thinking about stuff. Yeah. If there's evidence to support something like that, then it should be considered.
Mm-hmm. The biggest flaw is the total control thing. Because if you've ever talked to a human being who is part of an organization, there's no total control. Like, there's always chaos. There's always stupid. Like, I think a good example is something like Burn After Reading. I think Burn After Reading is a good example of what covert stuff in real life is actually like, and that it's just a total mess. Everything's chaotic. Nobody knows what they're doing. Yeah. You know.
Well, it's just people are unpredictable. And there's something, I think I was watching some podcast where they're talking about the conspiracy about, well, we never made it to the moon. It's all a big conspiracy by NASA. And the person who was arguing against it was like, think about this for a second. Think about the number of people who would have had to have been involved in that. And you think that after almost 50 years, that none of them would have come forward, that none of them would have said anything to their spouse, to their buddies while they were drinking, to their children, or published a manuscript or said, I don't care, I'm going to go to the newspaper and what are you going to do about it now? That nothing like that would have come out? That the White House can't keep anything unleaked for about 5 seconds. Why would you think that a conspiracy involving possibly tens of thousands of people would somehow be able to keep its trap shut this long? People talk even when they're told not to. They do it all the time.
Yeah, all the time.
I mean,
especially nowadays.
Yeah,
when everyone has everyone has a cell phone. So in effect, everyone has a camera and a very discreet recording device. Everyone can be a spy at any moment.
Yeah, at best, no one would have said anything.
Even worse is flat Earth stuff.
Oh, that's just dumb.
It makes no sense.
Stupid. That's just. I don't even know what that is, but that's just ridiculous.
When you fly across the ocean, you go up near the North Pole. Why would you do that? If the Earth was flat, you just go in a straight line. Like, you can measure that going in a straight line across the map, a flat map, is actually longer than doing the curvy line or whatever, because the Earth is curved. There's a curve to the Earth. Yeah. It just is.
What I don't get is that the flat Earth thing is that it violates a really basic principle about Occam's razor. I'm sure you've heard about it. Have you heard of it, Matt?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah. So Occam's razor. And this is the way you should think about it, is you should make the least number of assumptions while you're thinking. And something like the flat Earth thing, which is ridiculous that people even think that. There's no...
There's a documentary on Netflix
the whole
you can watch.
Way, everything about physics, everything about every part of modern science has to be wrong for you to be right. And what's more likely, that you, this person, has figured it all out, that it's just a big conspiracy, or that everything about science is wrong? I mean, come on. Really? Sorry, I know this isn't related to alternate history, but it's just...
Yeah, that kind of stuff is kind of frustrating. But,
You know what wasn't frustrating? The next story.
Oh, the next story was great. I loved it.
George Patton Slept Here by Roland Green. The divergence here is that Patton doesn't slap the guy in the hospital. That he has this weird, movie, almost movie scene thing where he sees his grandfather and his father, and they tell him, don't slap him, he's a good soldier. Leave this guy alone.
Mm-hmm. And he also notices, he says, wait a second, nurse. This man looks ill. Check his temperature. Oh my gosh, he has 103 temperature. It's not just that, he's afraid of fighting. He's actually physically ill. Mm-hmm. And because in real life, this whole blow up that happened was hugely bad for his career. It almost ended his career.
Yeah, it almost derailed it, yeah. Because Patton doesn't really get involved again until after the D-Day invasion. I mean, there's a whole almost year where he doesn't do anything because of it. But in this, it's told in the form of letters, memoirs, diary. It's mainly Patton's diary. It's actually, I think, almost all Patton's diaries entries, except for a couple other things. Bad speller, which is true.
Yes. There's a part where he's talking about a psychologist and he spells it as skyologist, which is kind of funny.
But so because of no slapping, he runs a better campaign in Sicily that actually cuts off the Germans as they're retreating, so they cause more damage. Then they invade Sardinia, and then from there they used bases in Sardinia to land at Civita Vecchio, which is a port right near Rome. So the Allies skip the whole brutal campaign south of Rome, north of Naples, that went on in 43 and in 44, which you should read Day of Battle.
I've been reading Day of Battle. It's fantastic.
Isn't it?
It's amazing.
It's depressing as hell, though.
Yes.
The Italian campaign,
Oh my
what
God.
a disaster.
The Rapido River.
Yeah.
Just like, what a mess. It's like, these are the parts of World War II nobody talks about because they're just crushing failures. Just people dying for basically no reason.
Yeah, no, I mean, the Italian campaign, because it was basically World War I almost, we were fighting again. And talk about Cassino, the fighting in the city of Cassino, taking Monte Cassino. It wasn't as easy as that Sean Bean pump-up video showed it to be. You just didn't run towards it and take it. I mean,
Yay.
the amount of effort the Allies put in to getting there is just crazy. But because of this, the Germans get encircled at Anzio, and they talk about how they crush up the panzers there, and Kesselring gets killed, and they talk about how the British battleships are great tank busters and all sorts of stuff like that.
Mark Clark also dies earlier in the campaign, so he's not in command.
He gets killed in a bombing raid. But basically the point is that Omar Bradley will remain in Italy. The campaign in Italy is basically a year ahead of schedule, and roughly a year, 10 months ahead of schedule. And Patton's going up to Northern Europe for more glory.
Yes. And that's the end of the story right there. Yeah, it's pretty well done.
Pretty well done.
It's pretty good.
Pretty well done. Yeah, and the slapping incident, too, is, if you're not as familiar with it, Patton went to, it's actually two separate incidents that happened in late July or early August of 43, where he went to some hospitals holding soldiers who've been injured during the Sicily campaign, and he slapped two of them because they had what we would call PTSD now, almost certainly. And he slapped them because he thought, you're not injured, where are your physical injuries? And, you're cowards and all this. And I think one of them, he almost threatened to shoot him or something like that. And it was kind of suppressed, but someone at the hospital, I think, eventually leaked it, if my memory is correct.
I think that's right, to like the press. And the press.
And there was
carried
actually
it.
a real question about whether the press was going to publish it or not, because this isn't like April of 45 in Europe where victory is assured. Victory is far from assured in August of 43. It's interesting enough, I think public opinion was kind of split over whether Patton was wrong or not, but it caused enough of an issue that Eisenhower came close to relieving him. But later on, it turned out, I don't know if it turned out they were ill. I think
one of them had like malaria or something, and at least one of them actually was in combat beforehand and returned to combat afterwards. It's not like, oh, this guy's a yellow coward.
Well, he thought they were cowards. Like, you're running, you're leaving your buddies out there. But Patton his psychology is very interesting. So
that is correct. A bit of an oddball.
Yeah. George C. Scott. He's really George C. Scott now. That's what everyone thinks of.
Right. What was the original Patton? Who knows? It's lost now.
It's lost now. They're only stories. Here comes the next story. The crown jewel.
The crown jewel. There's a little bit of Patton in this next story as well.
Max, I'll leave you the honors on this one.
Oh my gosh. Tarnished Glory. Custer and the Waffen SS. Oh my goodness. What a story. Now you may be asking yourself, how is Custer fighting the Waffen SS? Is he in the Waffen? What the hell is going on here? It's not what so when I started reading this, I thought it was going to be Custer II. George Custer has a kid, and that kid is a general in World War II. No, that's not what happens. Somehow, just Custer is just born, 50 years later?
Yeah, like 1889 or something like that.
Something to that effect, yeah.
No explanation why
No.
everything else stays the same, but this one family is like delayed in history.
It's complete lunacy. But yeah, he's just born in 1889. He goes to
West Point
and
becomes friends there with the one George Smith Patton.
Yes.
And they talk about how they're very different, but they struggle through. But it does mention that neither of them graduates at the bottom of their class. Custer was the GOAT of the West Point class, and that is not the greatest of all time. He graduated at the the very bottom of his class, and I think set the record for the most demerits anyone's ever gotten at West Point and still graduated with. But in this one, yeah. And he talks about, and he has a lot of similarities with Patton in this too, is that he believes that he was reincarnated, and talks about, he said he was a soldier in ancient Greece. He fought in Atlantis, and he died at the Indian Wars under the command of Major Marcus Reno at the Battle of the Little Bighorn.
So he's like the Dalai Lama, basically. You know, he dies and he gets reincarnated in a new body over and over again. But he's still him deep down.
But does anyone else? Does it happen to anyone else?
Yeah, like is Sitting Bull also reincarnated into the Waffen SS? Remember me, George?
It doesn't.
I'm back.
Yeah, so it's kind of a crazy divergence, but it makes, and it goes along, and Patton and Custer kind of inseparable, and then eventually Patton dies in the First World War, and then the way it's written is it sounds like Custer's adjutant is writing it in like the 1990s, about 50 years before. And he talks about like, Custer is incredibly dangerous, and it was probably good that he died. Spoiler alert, during the war.
He talks about like how he lies about certain parts of his history. Like,
and he lies for no reason about stuff.
Like George is like, oh, you've got to carry on the legacy of tanks. You have to do it. And then Custer talks about how, like, and then I adopted the tank from then on. But the guy points out that, no, he stayed with the cavalry after World War I.
And the tanks went to the infantry.
Yeah, yeah. Or, like, for instance, he talks about how he's a pallbearer at Patton's funeral, and he's not. Mm-hmm. But that's a nice touch.
And that Custer, as a general, has 3 pictures on his desk, one of Douglas MacArthur, one of himself, and a small picture of him and Patton. He talks about, he becomes like very involved in Republican politics, and he marries Libby Holman, who's a widow of a Reynolds tobacco heir. And it talks about in the story, like, much has been made of their relationship, much has been written, and movies have been made about it or whatever. Well, no one really knows about Beatrice Patton, who is Patton's wife. So it shows the differences is that, like, Custer's wife, people, the general public is interested in their relationship, where it's like no one remembers about Patton's family, really.
Yeah.
So, but basically here you have, it starts in World War II, 2nd Armored Division goes to Custer, and he does better in Tunisia. There's no slapping incident in Sicily, but it talks about how, like, he's luckier than anything else. Custer's luck is what they call it.
He's also a big Anglophobe. He hates Monty.
Him and Monty get along even worse than Patton and Montgomery did in real life, which is shocking. Really hard to achieve that. But long story short is that he's at D-Day. He like leads troops on D-Day because there was never that rebuff from the slapping incident. He leads them through France and basically is Patton in France. And then it comes to the Battle of the Bulge. He leads the relief of Bastogne.
He does that thing where he takes, 250,000 men and changes directions in a single day. Just like Patton did.
Yeah. But it talks about, too, how he's different from Patton, whereas Patton was very spit and polish. He's not very spit and polish. Patton is famous for wearing the shiny helmet and having the 2 guns. Custer has 1 pistol. He wears a slouch hat and drives around in a staff car rather than a Jeep.
Also, his hair is a little bit too long for fashion.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And so what happens is they relieve Bastogne, but then he keeps pushing forward against orders, and he gets into the mix with the 6th SS Panzer Army north of Bastogne.
The Hitler Youth, right?
But, they run into Hitler Jugend. It's because it's what they talk about. I think the divisions are 1st SS Panzer, 2nd SS Panzer, 9th SS Panzer, and 12th SS Panzer. So that's 9th is... 12th is the Hitler Jugend. 2nd is Das Reich. 1st is the Leibstandarte. And then 9th is...
Lair?
I always get the 9th and the 10th confused. They're the ones that are at Arnhem.
Or is it the Panzer Lair?
No, that's a separate. That's a here.
Oh, the one that's the key, right?
The key is the Leibstandarte, which is in Kelly's Heroes. If you look at the back of the Tiger, there's a key on the... Yeah, because they're supposed to be from the bodyguard unit for Hitler. So that's like bodyguard.
I guess you hold the keys to Hitler's bedroom or something. I don't know.
Safety, I don't know.
Who knows?
Whatever. Point is that he gets mixed up in it and he overstretches and the Americans get defeated and he gets killed. And he gets
the death scene's amazing.
Yeah.
Like a king tiger rolls up and Patton pulls out his 6-shooter. They're basically the same person.
Yeah.
Yes. Custer pulls out his 6-shooter and starts just blasting away at this king tiger.
And it just machine guns him right down.
The coaxial, yeah.
Yeah. But long story short is that the Germans hit Bastogne again. He's been trailing all this gas behind him, and they take that. So their renewed push towards the Meuse River, and then they managed to stop them, the Allies. And then Montgomery makes a big deal about how the Americans can't do anything. So he gets relieved, and then Eisenhower gets relieved, and then Omar Bradley becomes the head of SHAEF.
Supreme Commander.
Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Forces. And then it talks about how the Germans just get obliterated because they're overextended in the bulge. Like the whole bulge gets cut off, and they just get massacred. So it actually shortens the war, is kind of the hint, is that the war ends in April 45 rather than May.
The point of view character says, oh, yes, that definitely shortened the war. But they don't actually say when the war ends, so maybe it didn't. I don't know.
I don't know.
It's kind of hard to tell.
But the point is that this has more reverberations down the line. It talks about how Truman and Bradley run as a team in 48, and then in 52, Bradley runs as a Democratic candidate and wins and beats up on Eisenhower. And because of that, the right wing of the Republican Party breaks off and forms this constitutionalist party, which is like very, very, very right. There's like 3 big parties in the U.S. now.
Yeah, Robert Taft goes off and makes the Constitutionalist Party, which he like died of cancer in like the early 50s. So I guess he's not a player for very long.
Yeah. So the point is that this changes up a lot more than you'd realize, I guess. But fascinating. It's a good story. It's entertaining. It's interesting. Creighton Abrams shows up in it. He gets killed.
Who is Creighton Abrams?
Well, Creighton Abrams, who the Abrams tank is named
after.
Oh,
right. He was in Vietnam.
He was also the chief American commander in Vietnam after Westmoreland, and it talks about Westmoreland getting killed in this and Abrams getting killed, and like everyone just...
Who are we going to name our tanks after now? Bradley
tanks everywhere.
Infantry fighting vehicles everywhere. Yes. Wasn't there a
the Custer tank?
There was a movie with Mr. Tossed Salad and Scrambled Eggs himself, Kelsey Grammer, about the creation of the
David
Bradley.
Hyde Pierce.
Not David Hyde Pierce. No, he's not Mr.
Oh no.
That was The Perfect Guest, I think is the name of his film.
Ah, yes.
Yes, but Kelsey Grammer was in a movie about the creation of the Bradley fighting vehicle.
What?
Yes.
He did play George Washington in a TV movie. I remember watching that.
Oh, really?
Thinking, Frasier, what are you doing here?
It's not.
Don't you have to take care of Eddie?
It's not John. Oh, no, it's definitely not John Adams, because I remember who played him in that. What was the TV movie?
It was like a TV movie about Washington crossing the Delaware, and it's American Patriot, Kelsey Grammer.
Good guy. U.S. Virgin Islands Patriot, Kelsey Grammer.
Well, that's part of the U.S.
It is, technically.
Yeah, it is. We bought them from Denmark.
Their flag is amazing. It's a big eagle with a crest in the middle of the eagle, the letter V, and the letter I on the other side. It looks good. It's a nice looking flag. I like it.
Not like that Libyan flag. Ugh. Green. I think they've changed it now.
Well, yeah, it's much more generic. Before, just being green was bold, you know.
A bold choice.
A bold choice.
Muammar. Bold choice, Colonel Gaddafi.
Colonel.
But yes, before we finish up with this, the whole reincarnation, people being delayed birth, but that doesn't really change other stuff thing. The possibilities are endless, Max.
They're so endless. Maybe Custer could come back again, and he's like in Vietnam.
That's right. What if John Churchill, the victor at Blenheim, was born in 1914? Oh, it's like he was in the Korean War. What? It's like, I mean...
What if Theodore Roosevelt died, but then was reincarnated into his own son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr.? What if?
What if, Max?
The possibilities are endless.
They are. What if Theodore Roosevelt was born in 100 BC and was commanding tanks against... What if there were tanks on the Rubicon stopping Caesar from getting over?
Yes, and what if
Possibilities
Caesar...
are endless.
It's so silly.
Yeah, it is. But next up, compadres.
Yes.
SM Sterling.
Good old SM Sterling.
But there's no dirigibles in this. Unforgivable SM.
Not even any steam engines? I mean, come on, man.
No lesbian sex scenes either. Just. Ugh.
But one of his other trademarks, Theodore Roosevelt, is in this story.
Yes, he is.
He loves Theodore Roosevelt.
Who doesn't?
I think the reason he loves him is because under Theodore Roosevelt, that was like the biggest expansion of United States borders ever.
Yeah. Well, not really. That's actually, you really should like James Polk.
Polk, yes.
Jefferson,
that's true. I hadn't thought
Polk.
about that. Polk, yes.
Polk. James Knox Polk. But this one, Teddy Roosevelt's about to be sworn in as president with his vice president, a Doroteo Arango, you could say.
They keep calling him Francisco.
Francisco Villa. Pancho Villa is his vice president because basically they hint that in the Mexican-American War, the border got set farther south of Chihuahua and Sonora, so that part became part of the U.S. And Pancho Villa fights in Teddy Roosevelt at San Juan Hill, and they become best friends. They become compadres even. But I looked this up at one point. I think Pancho Villa was not old enough to have been vice president in 1905 when this would have happened.
Well, I know that there's a limit to the president.
No, vice president has to be 35 as well, I think. I think that's how they interpret it. The president definitely has to be 35 years old.
But it's a nice story.
It's a short story. That's good.
It's quite short. And, you get that punchline in there. It's actually written with another guy. Richard Foss is his name.
Oh, okay.
Maybe the original version was just too explicit for this collection, and they had to pare down. Theodore Roosevelt and Pancho Villa are actually both women. That's the biggest divergent of all.
And they're on this dirigible. And America extends all the way down to Brazil.
All the way down to Antarctica. Compadres, I think, was the original title. But Harry Turtledove said, no SM, we can't do that.
We got to cut this back a little bit. And there's a few other stories in this that we're not going to talk about as much.
Yeah, not in super depth. There's a story that's kind of got a funny idea, 12 Legions of Angels. It's set in a world where the Germans invaded Britain, took over Britain, and there's a guy, Hugh Dowding,
who is the leader of the RAF during fighter command, at least, during the Battle of Britain, and his approach is what helped win the battle for the British.
But in this, he was relieved because he refused to send Spitfires to France during the fall of France because they were needed to defend Britain. And he's written a work of alternate history. And the work of alternate history is just history, yes.
It's us, Talkernate history.
Oh, my God.
No, but the alternate history is our history.
Yes. So it's kind of like an extended kind of inside joke between the author and the reader.
And then next is In the Prison of His Years, in which William Butler Yeats, W.B. Yeats, famous Irish poet, becomes like a big part of the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916. Don't know a lot about William Butler Yeats. Don't know a ton about the Easter Rising.
Me neither.
But I know he's a poet, so why would he be a general?
Has there ever been a general who has composed poetry?
Probably Alexander the Great.
Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Oh!
What is that? Something in the King? Sabiba in the King?
Yeah. It's like a romance novel written by Saddam Hussein. Speaking of which, our boy Zhugi, Yosip Zhugashvili, a.k.a. Stalin, wrote Georgian poetry in Georgian.
Oh.
And it still exists today.
Oh.
But that's kind of the only example I can think of.
He was just bored. He was just waiting for Hitler. Thank you, Stephen Kotkin.
1929 to 1941, specifically. He was waiting for Hitler at that point. Great book. Fantastic book. Stalin, Volume 2. Beautiful.
Magnifico.
This is the next story. I didn't really... I must admit, I did not read this one.
Labor relations, I can't get through it.
Esther Friesner. She wrote An Old Man's Summer in the last compilation. I thought that story was pretty darn good. This one is just bizarre.
It's something to do with Korea in like 400 or 500 AD. I know nothing about it.
Zero.
And this also has like magic in it, which poo-poo on that.
A wag of the finger for that one.
A wag of the finger.
Oh, gosh. Might as well be putting aliens in it. Might as well be putting Michael Dukakis talking to aliens in your story, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah. I actually do want to read this, but, unfortunately, I just didn't really have time.
I refuse to.
Empire. Now, this is a great story. So it all starts with...
The First Galactic Empire.
Thunderous applause. But Natalie Portman isn't so sure. She's sitting there next to Jimmy Smits, and they're just not so sure about that. No, I was thinking more Terrence Howard on this one. Empire.
Oh, Empire, yeah. Jussie Smollett.
Jussie Smollett in the news recently.
Yeah, Empire. So yeah, because that's the divergence here is that Terrence Howard.
He reinvented math.
Yes, I was about to say that about that. Look that up, and then you will just scratch your head, and like me, you will scratch your head so hard that you'll pick down probably to your brain because
He's like,
I don't get it. I don't get why Rhodey Rhodes, the guy who plays Colonel Rhodes in the first Iron Man,
one movie,
reinvented math,
and then replaced by Don Cheadle in the next film. Yeah, he like insists that, for instance, 3 times 0 is actually 3. It's not 0 because any number multiplied by 0 is going to be itself, obviously, and just weird stuff like that.
No.
I'm not a mathematician. You're not a mathematician.
Yeah, neither of us are. I'm certainly not a mathematician.
It's kind of the Occam's razor thing, is that I just trust that mathematicians know what they're talking about when they say 3 times 0 equals 0.
3 times 1 equals 3.
Yes. But no,
but you, the star of Empire, have reinvented math.
This conspiracy that we're trying to keep this under wraps, you're going to blow the lid off of everything. No, I'm so sorry. This has nothing to do with any of that stuff. Empire is a Napoleon story. Yes.
He's back.
I love Napoleon stories. Now, I don't like when a Napoleon story is a bit silly, like this one.
This is a bit silly.
You know, it's the classic Napoleon goes to America kind of thing. You see that a lot in alternate history. In this particular case, however, he goes to America immediately after he and his family leaves Corsica. So he doesn't even really go to France, really. Yeah, he goes to the United States, and he hooks up with Aaron Burr. So this is kind of a connection to alternate presidents a little bit, that story in there. The two of them kind of collaborate with one another, and they end up doing that plan by Aaron Burr to create a separate country in the middle of the United States. The borders of this country isn't really clear, but they
mostly the Louisiana Purchase is what it seems like. And they conquer parts of the United States, but then the British come.
Wellington, specifically. There's some parallels with actual Napoleon's career. He goes into Mexico and sets up his brother as king there, and his brother ends up getting shot, kind of like going into Spain, or setting up one of his brothers as the king.
Joseph, I think. Yeah,
Joseph in this case. Joey Napoleon. Good old Joey. There's also a parallel with the campaign in Russia. He goes up into Canada, and, he fights in the winter, and they have to turn back and go back home. And, it's fun. Davy Crockett is in it.
Yeah, Sam Houston.
Just like in Alternate Warriors.
Oh, yeah.
These things, they keep coming up. Sam Houston's also in it. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was pretty darn good.
Yeah. It's enjoyable, yeah.
And at the end, Napoleon slips away to, I guess, go on to some other career later. Though it's pretty late in his life at this point. He's pretty corpulent and in not great health. My one complaint, did not talk about his hemorrhoids. You got to talk about his hemorrhoids.
That's what laid him low.
Yes. I have had hemorrhoids, and they have certainly laid me low in my life.
That's why you lost the Battle of Waterloo.
That's true.
No Austerlitz for you.
No Austerlitz for me.
It's been good talking about this. It's a good story compilation.
Yeah, this was pretty darn good. I liked it a lot. You had some great highs and not really any lows, honestly. I mean, it's pretty darn good.
Yeah. So.
Thank you, Harry.
Good job.
Maybe make an alternate Generals 4. I don't know.
Well, we got to get to alternate Generals 3, which has its own crop of interesting stories.
Yeah, maybe by the end of that, we'll think maybe nix the alternate Generals 4 at that point. But it's been wonderful talking about these fantastic stories with you.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So this is Matt signing off.
And this is Max signing off.
Have a good day, guys.